Hello class, today we're going to be looking at our first biomolecule, which is carbohydrates. And don't forget, we're going to be talking about 4 biomolecules. First carbohydrates, then proteins, then lipids, and then we'll be talking a little bit about nucleic acids, but not too much because we're going to talk extensively about nucleic acids in the spring when we talk about genetics. So first, let's look at foods that are high in carbohydrates. So we have 2 main groups of carbohydrates. We've got complex carbohydrates, which include things like pasta, bread, potatoes, and rice. They tend not to taste as sweet. Okay, so these are complex carbohydrates. We've got a beautiful picture right there. And then at the bottom, we have some simple sugars. So these are things that we would consider rather sweet, maybe more dessert items. They include pop or soda, candy, ice cream, fruit, and everything that you see in this beautiful picture. So these things contain more simple sugars. So this is a check for understanding. So just a few questions I'm going to throw in to our presentation just so you can make sure that you understand what's going on. They also might be really good practice questions for our quiz coming up probably next week. So let's first look at this question. So it says, which breakfast food is not a good source of carbohydrates? So not all foods are carbohydrate rich. So I'm going to ask you to pause, think it through, and take your best guess, and then start again and we'll talk through the answer. Okay, so pause and give it a try first. All right, so welcome back. So if we're looking at these foods, we're trying to find the one that is not rich in carbohydrates. So if we look, fruit is rich in carbohydrates, so that's not the best answer. Milk and cereal is also carbohydrate rich, so milk has a carbohydrate in it, and so does cereal. Cereal is really, really high in carbohydrates, and oatmeal is also extremely high in carbohydrates. It's a grain. If we look at the bottom, G, eggs and bacon. Eggs and bacon do not contain a lot of carbohydrates, so eggs and bacon are really rich in proteins and lipids, but not carbohydrates. So D is our best answer. So here's some general information about carbohydrates. So we can also call them sugars, starches, and saccharides. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in about a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So that means that we always have about twice as much hydrogen as we have carbon and oxygen within our molecules. They also are our #1 source of energy. So 1 gram of carbohydrates contains 4 kilocalories of energy. So it's really energy rich, and this is where our body depends on carbohydrates as our first source of energy. So now we're going to look at some monosaccharides or some simple sugars. So monosaccharide means one, so mono, one sugar or one ring. They're generally used for quick energy, so they do not require digestion to be used by our body. They are the basic unit or the building blocks of all of the other carbohydrates. And if we look at the bottom, though we're going to talk about 2 types of monosaccharides, or actually 3 in the picture. So this is an image of the different carbohydrate molecules, or the monosaccharide molecules. So they contain fructose, glucose, and galactose. So those are 3 monosaccharides. They have slightly different, so ever so slightly different structures. And if we look, they're typically represented with these ring-like shapes. So we either have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a pentagon, or a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hexagon-shaped sugar. It's normally simplified and we use a ring to represent that sugar. So that's why they said that they can also be called one ring. So these little points, okay, so these points in this shape, in the polygon, actually represent carbon atoms. So there's a carbon atom at each of those little points in the shape. And we'll talk more about that next week. But if we look at our first one, so our first example was glucose, so that's this one in the center. Glucose is the product of photosynthesis. So when plants capture sunlight, they take that energy and they store that solar energy from radiation in this form of chemical energy, or glucose. So it's made by plants. It's also the type of sugar that we utilize within our body. So we're able to transport glucose through our blood. So when people get a blood sugar test, they're actually looking for blood glucose levels. And it's so small, so glucose is so small that it can fit into your cells. So glucose can travel into your individual cells, and there it can be transformed into a form of cellular energy called ATP to be used as cellular energy. And we'll talk extensively about that later, but I want you to know that it is small enough to travel through our bloodstream and into our cells. Fructose. Fructose is fruit sugar. So you can kind of see the FRU and think fruit. So this is the sugar type that's found in fruit. And it actually is the sweetest of all of the sugars. So if we had like a taste test of the different sugars, this one would be the sweetest one. Next we have our disaccharides. So disaccharides, that means two sugars or two rings. So you can see different disaccharides over here. So you take two of those monosaccharides, put them together, boom, disaccharide. Perfect. So disaccharides need to be digested or broken apart within our body. They're already too big to fit into our individual cells, so they have to be broken apart in order to be transported around our bodies. These monosaccharides are bound together by a type of covalent bond called a glycosidic bond, and we'll talk way more about that next week. And we have three examples. We have sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar, so if you drink tea or coffee, or if you eat fruit and sometimes you take a spoonful of sugar and you sprinkle it in there, that's sucrose, so it's a disaccharide. Lactose is milk sugar, so it's the type of sugar or carbohydrate that you would find in milk. And maltose is another type of disaccharide. So maltose has a very distinct flavor. So sometimes you can get a drink called a malt or a malted milkshake. And if you get a malted milkshake, it's like they make a milkshake with whichever type of ice cream you prefer. If you prefer, vanilla or chocolate, and they add a spoonful of the maltose sugar to it, and it has a really, really distinct flavor. So if you have not had one, you can take the opportunity, and if you see it on a menu, try to get a malt and try that sugar out. Then we have our polysaccharides. So poly means many, so these are many sugars, or also called our complex carbohydrates. Polysaccharides can be huge. So they can be hundreds and hundreds of monosaccharides put together. And typically speaking, they do not have a sweet taste at all. They have more of a starchy taste, like a potato. Here are types of polysaccharides. There's three main types of polysaccharides that you need to know. One of them is called glycogen. So glycogen has a branched chain of glucose. If you look down at the bottom, this looks like a tree branch. So we have a chain of glucose put together over here, and then it branches off, and we have another branch here. Okay, another little branch over here. Glycogen is a form that animals use to store carbohydrates. So we store carbohydrates within our bodies in the form of glycogen, and that can happen in our muscle cells and also in our liver cells. So if later we really need energy, we can access the energy stored there. There's another form of polysaccharide called cellulose. Cellulose is straight chains that are packed really closely together, and they're usually found in plants. So we're talking about really tough, fibrous material within a plant. So it's packed so closely together that it's really excellent for structure. So if we're talking about a cell wall, if you're thinking about the trunk of a tree, okay, that's really solid and fibrous. It contains a lot of cellulose. And cellulose molecules are so densely packed that the iodine can't react with them. So iodine cannot penetrate this molecule in order to create a color change or a chemical reaction, which is why even though it's a polysaccharide, it does not have a positive iodine test, because the molecule is just too dense. It's impenetrable, so it cannot react with iodine. On the far end, we have starch. So starch is a coiled chain of glucose, so it looks like a little spiral. You can think about a little spiral, okay, coming down here. This is a starch molecule. So starch molecules are used within plants to store their energy. So if you think about a potato plant builds this potato underground as a tuber, and what it's actually doing is storing energy there so that it can use it later. Unfortunately, typically, I would think that people steal that source of energy and we eat it. But the point of it for the plant is to store energy for later on. So here's a check for understanding. It's going to have you match the type of carbohydrate with their size. So give that a shot and then we'll get back to it. Okay, so pause now. All right, welcome back. So we have sucrose. We said sucrose is table sugar, which is a disaccharide. Glucose. Glucose is the type of sugar that we find in our blood and can go into our cells. It's super tiny and is a monosaccharide. And amylose is the technical name for starch. So starch or amylose is a polysaccharide. And you might notice that our carbohydrates generally end in ose. So cellulose, fructose, sucrose, glucose, amylose. Okay, that's a way that we indicate that it's a carbohydrate with that type of naming. With that type of name, ending in the ose. Here's another check for understanding. So pause and give it a shot. So our simplest form, in their simplest form, all carbohydrates are built from which building block? All right, so welcome back. So the building block for all carbohydrates is a monosaccharide. So here's some basics of carbs in the body. I will probably show you some information like this again, but with a lot more detail. So we're starting off with what happens to carbohydrates when we consume them. So we have this guy just having a light pasta dinner, no big deal, just a regular amount of pasta. Okay, so he's eating his dinner. Okay. When this guy eats his carb dinner, the main site of digestion for those carbohydrates is going to be the small intestine. So not the stomach, but all the way past the stomach in the small intestine, that's where the carbohydrates are typically broken down. And we take these complex carbohydrates in our small intestine, we break them down into their simplest form, which is glucose or monosaccharides. Once they're monosaccharides, so once it's into this form of glucose, then two things can happen to that glucose. So it'll go from the small intestine into the bloodstream or into the circulatory system. That's how we move materials to the cells and to every part of our body. So it ships this glucose around the body. The first thing that can happen is if cells are in need of energy, then that glucose can be used immediately in the cells as energy. The other thing that can happen is the cells don't need any more energy, so they're fine, they don't need to charge up, they've got the glucose they need. Then that extra glucose will go to the liver or the muscles to be stored as glycogen, so that later on, when this guy needs some energy, his cells need some energy, then his body can tap into that storage of energy within his muscles or liver and take the glycogen apart and send some of that sugar around the bloodstream to feed his cells again. So check for understanding the name of the polysaccharide, which acts as stored carbohydrates in the liver or muscles. So give it a shot. All right. I hope that you remember just from a minute ago that the stored carbohydrate that we're talking about within our bodies is glycogen. All right, so that's all for today. I will see you soon. Okay, have a good day.